And the reality is that Ramaphosa has been sent to do exactly that. He has been sent right from the beginning, when he entered the African National Congress, when he was parachuted into the position as Secretary General of the ANC at the first legal national conference of the ANC in Durban in 1991, June 1991, I was there. He was parachuted in. Who was Cyril Ramaphosa? What was his relationship to the African National Congress? Yes, he ran a union called the National Union of Mine Workers, which was a sweetheart union, set up together with the Oppenheimers and the Menels by him, where the offices of the NUM were all within the premises of Anglo-American and paid for by Anglo-American. So here came Cyril Ramaphosa, Mr. Nobody in the ANC. But because the Menels and the Oppenheimers told Nelson Mandela that they thought he's a good idea to become the Secretary General of the African National Congress, Mandela started elevating him. And remember also that white monopoly capital is very clever. They do not do things on the spur of the moment. They plan. They think ahead. You know what sometimes is forgotten by us is that the Menels, for instance, saw that Nelson Mandela was one day going to become the president of South Africa. Even during those terrible times of apartheid, when he was on Robben Island, Mama Winnie Madikizela Mandela was suffering in Soweto, and she had the challenge to take care of 2 young girl children. Remember, Zenani and Zinzi were 3 and 5 years old when Mandela was arrested. So here comes Mrs. Menel, the wife of Clive Menel, the second largest mining enterprise in South Africa, and she presents herself as the one who can help. Who paid for Zinzi and Zenani's schooling in Swaziland? The Menels. Who took care of how they were transported from South Africa to Swaziland to go to school, the passports that they needed, all the arrangements that needed to make? Irene Menel. If you go back into the history of Nelson Mandela and the letters that he wrote from Robben Island, it's all there now in the Nelson Mandela Museum. Yeah, it's called the Institute for Memory of Mandela. The letters are there. To Irene Menel, my dear Irene, I'm so grateful for what you do for my family. Thank you. So who was one of the first people that Nelson Mandela visited and thanked when he came out of prison? The Menels. Who were the people who told Mandela that Cyril Ramaphosa is a very good idea to become the Secretary General of the ANC? The Menels. Who were the people who brought Cyril Ramaphosa into the Urban Foundation when he was still a young man, and who actually paid for his studies? Because remember, it was the Menels who paid for Cyril's legal studies. It was the Menels. What did Irene Menel say about Cyril Ramaphosa when they nominated him to become a member of the board of the Urban Foundation? She said, "We are bringing Mr. Ramaphosa in as an insurance policy for the future. So he will know who we are and will protect us." So you see the plan. You see how far it goes back. You see how Cyril Ramaphosa entered the African National Congress. What the Menels were doing with regards to President Nelson Mandela. All of that. And here comes Ramaphosa at that conference in Durban. And on the stage sits Oliver Tambo. Now, President OR was not very well at that time because he had 2 strokes. But he was still the longest serving president of the African National Congress and someone with an incredible institutional memory of who were who inside the ANC. And he sees this young man coming in, promoted by Mandela and carried on the shoulders, and he sits there, and I'm not telling you this is hearsay, because I was on that stage, I heard him asking it. He says, he looks at him, he says, Obani Lo. Who is that? And that, Nsiki, is the question that we need to ask ourselves today. Obani Lo, Cyril Ramaphosa. Who are you? Why are you taking us along this road that you've taken us? Why are you entering us into a coalition with white supremacists? What is your mission? Because clearly your mission is one that had been given to you many decades ago to protect as an insurance policy for white monopoly capitalist interests in South Africa. And that is why Ramaphosa negotiated in the way that he negotiated the CODESA negotiations. Why he had to push and shove and maneuver to become the chief negotiator of the African National Congress. Because remember, when he was the Secretary General of the ANC, initially he wasn't the chief negotiator. Thabo Mbeki was the chief negotiator. But when Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma and Nelson Mandela were traveling overseas, Ramaphosa managed to maneuver together with Pravin Gordhan, Mohamed Vali Musa, and all of those accolades that he has around him, a meeting of the National Executive Committee of the ANC, where they removed Thabo Mbeki as the chief negotiator, removed Jacob Zuma as the head of intelligence, and placed Cyril Ramaphosa as the chief negotiator. And the problems that we are faced with since 1994, Ntsiki, with what came out of the CODESA negotiations, can be traced back to the agreements that was made between the National Party apartheid regime, white monopoly capitalism, and this man representing the African National Congress. It was the most incredible relationship I've ever seen between Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer. You know, those 2 guys were like, perhaps I shouldn't say it, they were almost like lovers.
Why are you going to get me into trouble?
They were so close. I want you to go and do research and find some of the photos of them sitting there holding hands during the negotiations. There was a front page photo in Time magazine of Cyril and Rolf sitting like this, holding hands. The deals that were presented at the plenary sessions of CODESA were all negotiated beforehand. They all happened behind the scenes. There were regular meetings where Ramaphosa, together with the ANC's negotiating team, people who he had handpicked, had gone to game farms for a weekend. They sit, they work this thing out, they drink, they jowl. They come back with a cooked up agreement. Then that cooked up agreement get presented in the plenary of CODESA. And remember, they agreed on this very interesting phrase, sufficient consensus. So if there's sufficient consensus for an agreement that they table at the plenary of CODESA, it goes through. And what was sufficient consensus? The ANC and the National Party agreed, because they're the big bulls in the crop. then whoever else doesn't like it or doesn't want to go ahead are just shoved to the side.
GNU.
So, sufficient consensus. And today, and I'm glad you make that connection because it's actually a very good one. Remember, this agreement that had now been signed between the ANC and the DA under the supervision of Madam Helen Zille. Remember what she told Fikile Mbalula. She said, you mustn't talk about that you can do what you want. Go and look at, I can't remember the number of the clause, go and look at that clause. We have an agreement on sufficient consensus. And that sufficient consensus includes that at least 60% of those who are part of this so-called GNU, and I deliberately call it GNU because it's like a hybrid animal. This so-called GNU, 60% of those who have those seats in the National Assembly must agree before a decision can go through. Now, I'm afraid Fikile Mbalula